Did you know that you have been called to a higher purpose? A purpose that far exceeds the mundane routines of your daily life. A purpose that is individual because God has created you in a very unique way and you have a unique set of gifts. A calling that encompasses the larger vision of God establishing his kingdom right here on earth. Each one of you sitting here this morning has a divine purpose, but it's different than the one sitting next to you. So in order to drive this point home, I just want you to take a moment and turn to your neighbor, and I want you to say, I thank you for your calling, but it's not mine. Thank you for your calling, but it's not mine. All right, don't slow down on me. Turn to the neighbor on the other side and say, thank you for your calling, but it's not mine. The person sitting next to you does not have your calling. You may be a teacher and you may be sitting next to a teacher, but that doesn't mean that you had the same calling because God created you uniquely. We have 3 pastors on staff at this church. We've all been called to pastor, to lead a church. But we're all created differently. All 3 have different skill sets. All 3 are very unique to do what God has called us to do, and that is to lead the church. Everyone's calling is individual. If you look throughout the biblical narrative from Genesis to Revelation, you will see this. You remember there was a man named Noah. He was called to build an ark. What a unique calling. There was a man by the name of Abram. You would know him later on as Abraham. He was called to go and find a new land to establish a new nation so his offspring would prosper for generations to come. You may remember a man by the name of Gideon. Gideon was called to go and save the Israelites from the hand of the Midianites. Or you can think about this young girl. She was a foreigner in a foreign land. She was a Hebrew, but God called her to become queen of that land. Her name was Esther. And God raised her up and made her queen of this land so she could save the Hebrew people from extinction. She had a unique calling. But also think about another man. His name was Saul. You know him as Paul. He had a very unique calling as well. He was persecuting the church. He was killing Christians. And God brought him to his knees on the road to Damascus and called him to go and spread the gospel to the Gentiles. There's another lady. Her Hebrew name was Miriam. You know her as Mary. She was divinely called by God to carry the Savior of the world. What is your calling? What is your divine purpose on this earth? You have one. You may be called to mentor young men or young women. Maybe you're called to go and spread the gospel. Maybe you're called to lead a Bible study or shepherd our young children in our children's ministry. What's your calling? If you wrestle with the question, some of you are going to say, you know what, Todd, I don't know. And that's okay. If you don't know, let me know that. Come and see me. We want to help you figure out what your calling is. What is your calling? What is your divine purpose on earth? A lot of people begin wrestling with this later in life when their life is coming to a close. They start wrestling with, what has this all been about? What am I here for? My grandmother was 101 years old, and for probably the last 10 or 15 years of her life, she kept asking me, why am I here? And I said, you know what? God's not done with you. If God was done with you, you'd be standing in heaven rejoicing right now. You have a calling. It doesn't matter what stage of life you're in. Well, you're probably familiar with the character of Batman, but I bet you don't know the calling of Bruce Wayne. Bruce Wayne was born the son of a wealthy Gotham couple. Their name was Martha and Thomas Wayne. One evening, Martha and Thomas were walking home from a movie with their young son, Bruce, when a mugger jumped out of an alleyway and attacked them to rob them. He didn't leave the scene until a fight ensued, and the mugger eventually took the life of Martha and Thomas Wayne. Bruce was left an orphan in that moment. He would be raised by the caretaker of the Wayne estate, Alfred Pennyworth. If you follow Batman, you probably have only heard the name Alfred. He seems to act sort of like his butler in the estate. That's who raised him. But at a young age, Bruce swore that he would avenge his parents' death. And at the age of 14, he traveled the world and learned all kinds of skills to become Gotham's greatest crime fighter. Bruce wanted to strike fear in the hearts of the criminals, of the people of Gotham, the criminals of Gotham. So he created the concept of this Caped Crusader because he himself had a fear of bats. So him and his now adopted father, Alfred, created the Batman. Now, if you pull your phone out and you pull up Google Maps and type in Gotham, you're probably not going to find it. But if you go outside on a dark night sky and you look up into the air, you may see the bat signal burning above the city of Gotham. That bat signal calls the Batman into service. It's there that he goes and he meets Commissioner Gordon at that bat signal, and Commissioner Gordon tells him what the needs are for him at this very moment. Well, if you've been in the church very long, you may start picking up some of the similarities between Batman or Bruce Wayne's calling and the calling of Moses. Let me show you a little bit more what I'm talking about. Today we're going to be working out of Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3. I invite you to take your Bibles out and follow along with me. Exodus chapter 3. As you're making your way there, I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of history of Moses if you haven't heard that story in the past. Moses was born in a very turbulent time. There was a new king on the throne. We would call him a Pharaoh. And this Pharaoh was not a friend of the Hebrew people. Why? Well, frankly, I think because there were too many of them. And when there's an enormous amount of people, they become a threat to your power. So one of the ways in history kings have controlled people that were a threat to his power is to enslave them. And this is what the Pharaoh did. He enslaved the Hebrew people in Egypt. So this king then creates an order that says all newborn Hebrew boys should be thrown into the river. Well, if you know the story of Moses, you know that his birth parents, his birth mother, didn't throw him in the river. She took him down the river, she placed him in a basket, and she just kind of let him go. It's in that river that the daughter of Pharaoh finds Moses and takes Moses as her own child. Now, I want you just to think about this just for a second. Moses lost his birth parents at a very young age. Bruce Wayne lost his parents at a very young age. That Moses grew up as royalty in the house of Pharaoh. Bruce Wayne was raised as the wealthy heir to the Wayne estate. Both of these people had similar lavished upbringings. So I just want you to keep in mind that Moses is the adopted son of Pharaoh. After Moses grew up, you may know this part of the story, he grew up, and the story says that he's out in the field watching over the slaves. There's some Egyptian guards out there also guarding the slaves. And Moses sees an Egyptian guard beating one of the slaves, and he steps in to prevent the beating. Well, a fight ensues, and Moses ends up killing this Egyptian guard. Not only that, then Moses, he's kind of freaked out because he's afraid that the Pharaoh will be angry with him. So he buries this Egyptian guard in the sand. He wants to cover up his crime, and then he flees because he knows if he doesn't flee, then the Pharaoh will come and take his life. Who's the Pharaoh? Well, it started out to be his grandfather. But now time's passed, the Pharaoh probably at this point is his brother. But he knows that they rule with an iron hand and they don't allow any of this. And you just killed one of my pieces of commodity, one of my commodities. So he knew he wouldn't like it. So Moses flees and goes away out of Egypt. And so we're going to pick up our story in chapter 3. We're going to start with just verses 1 and 2. Follow along with me. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire, and out of the bush he looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. So Moses has left this area where he has killed this Egyptian. He's settled down in the area of Midian. Now, I want you just to get a little geography in your head. If you see a world map in your brain, right, over here you have Egypt. Right beside Egypt is this little land called the Sinai Peninsula. And then over to the right is Israel. So Moses has fled Egypt, and he has gone to the Sinai Peninsula, down to the tip of it, to a place called Midian. And it's there in Midian that Moses would marry a priest's daughter, and her name was Zipporah. And the word just told us that Moses is out tending to his father-in-law's flock at Mount Horeb. Now, this is important, so stay with me. If you know the story of the Ten Commandments, when Moses receives the Ten Commandments, what mountain is Moses standing on? Mount Sinai. Guess what? Mount Sinai and Mount Horeb is the same place. Mount Sinai and Mount Horeb is the same place. So get the picture in your head. Moses was in Egypt. He flees because he killed someone. He goes to Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai. He gets a calling from God in this bush. He goes back to Egypt. He frees the people, and he brings them to Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, the home of his family. This was before they go out into the wilderness. So they're not out in the wilderness when he receives the Ten Commandments yet. So just keep all this in your head. So you're sitting there saying, okay, Todd, this is getting confusing. Why do they say then Mount Horeb and Mount Sinai? Why don't we just call it one name? Because it comes from two different traditions. Let me give you another example. When you read the Old Testament, you will see the word Lord in the Old Testament. The Hebrew word for Lord is Yahweh. We would write it Y-H-W-H, Yahweh. But you'll also see the word God in the Old Testament. That word is Elohim, Elohim. You have two words, both describing our almighty creator, but both come out of different traditions. Horeb and Sinai come out of two different traditions, but they mean the exact same place. What I want you to be focused on today is that Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, is the mountain of God. And this mountain, there will be many significant things will take place on this mountain throughout the biblical narrative. In verse 2, it tells us an angel of Yahweh has appeared in a burning bush. Now, what is the role of angels in the Bible? Messengers, right? Angels are messengers. This may upset some of you, but here's a newsflash. When you die and go to heaven, you do not become an angel. An angel is a heavenly being. Angels are messengers of God. When Jesus was resurrected and appeared to Mary Magdalene and the disciples, he wasn't walking around with wings on. He was in a heavenly body, but he was not angelic. That's a whole different animal. So Moses is there. This angel appears in this burning bush. This angel is a messenger. He's announcing the coming of the Lord. He's announcing the coming of God. He's saying, hey, Moses, guess what? God is coming. Are you ready? Are you prepared? He's fixing to be here. He's right behind me. I just left him. He's getting the last drink, a cup of coffee. He's going to be here just a second. But Moses, he's not interested in what this angel is telling him. He's mesmerized that this bush is not burning up. He's going, well, look at this. This is crazy. Here's an angel talking to you in a bush. You're not even listening to the angel. You're just going, wow, look at that. Let's move on, verses 3 through 6. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why this bush is not burned up. He didn't say, look, I must turn aside and listen to what this angel's telling me. I need to see why this bush is not burning up. When the Lord, Yahweh, saw that he had turned aside to see, God now shows up on scene. God, Elohim, called to him from a bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. And then God said, come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place in which you are standing is holy ground. And God said, Father, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. So the writer has now shifted from telling us that an angel of God has appeared in this bush to telling us that now here God is in the flesh in this bush. So why do you think the bush wasn't burning up? It says Moses was mesmerized about this bush. Why did the bush burn up? I don't think the bush was on fire at all. My personal opinion. I don't think the bush was on fire at all. I think that bush was aflame with God's radiant glory. I think that's a picture of heaven. I think when you get to heaven, you're going to see God in all of his glory, all of his radiance, and you're going to go, wow. You're not going to care what they're doing over here or what they're doing over here. Your eyes are just going to be focused on this glory. And that's what's happening to Moses here. He wasn't worried about the angel because he's like, wow, what is this? And the Bible says that he falls to the ground and he hides his face. Why does he do that? Because they believed if you ever see God, that you'll be struck down. So he's fallen to his face and he's protecting himself, right? Now, I've told you this before, that this tradition continued on even after the temple was built and the Holy of Holies was built. When a priest would go into the Holy of Holies once a year and he would offer sacrifices up to God for the sins of the people. And when he went in there, when the priest went in there, the other priest would tie a rope around his ankle. And as he went in there, if he was to see the glory of God, if he was to see the presence of God and be struck down, the other priest would not have to go in there and get the body. They could just drag him out by the rope. Pretty serious, huh? So this is what's happening to Moses. He puts his face to the ground. Let's move on. Verses 7 through 9. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I've heard the cry on the account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings. And I've come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land to a land that is good and a broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So what's God's issue here? God is concerned about the suffering and the oppression of his people. Why did Bruce Wayne become Batman? Because he wanted to rid Gotham of all crime and suffering. He didn't want another child to experience what he experienced. He didn't want another child to grow up without their parents because of the crime that was going on in Gotham. So he became Batman to rid Gotham of all their crime. So now God is going to send Moses into Egypt and to declare to the Pharaoh, probably his brother, what all the wrongdoings that he's doing is. Now, I wonder how many of you this morning, if God said, hey, I want you to go tell a Pharaoh, a king, a president, everything that they're doing wrong. Now, slip yourself, some of you are like, oh, I'll go tell the president what he's doing wrong. But slip yourself back into Moses' time. If you did that, what would happen? Man, Moses knew that they ruled with an iron hand. He grew up in the house of Pharaoh. He knew there was no way that he's going to go and tell his brother of everything he's doing wrong. So Moses starts saying, well, wait a minute, God, I'm not really the person for this job. Look at verse 10. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and this will be a sign for you that is I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. You see what Moses said in verse 11? Who am I? Look at my place in life, God. Who am I to go do this kind of work? God, I'm just a shepherd with a borrowed herd. I have nothing in life. Why would you send me to go do this? Surely there's somebody else out there. And God sort of turns the tables and says, don't worry, Moses, I'm going to be with you. Friends, you need to understand when God calls you to do something, it's not a go at it on your own plan. God is with you. God is among us right now. God is not some God that sits on a throne, floats around on a cloud, watching what you do every day. God is with you. He will not abandon you. God will be with you in your calling. I think Moses is a lot like us. When God calls us to a mighty task, it's easy to begin shifting our focus from the power and the might and the majesty and the grace and the love of God to our own human weakness. Oh, God, I can't do that. Well, no, you can't do that. But God can do it through you. That's the challenge. Look at verse 13. But Moses said to God, if I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said further, thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. So Moses is trying to give God another reason why he's not accepting his call. And Moses says, well, God, they haven't worshiped you in a long time, centuries, because they've been enslaved. What if they come and say, well, who is this God that sent you to us? Because the Egyptians worship many gods. They want to know which God it is that sent Moses. So Moses said, what am I supposed to tell them? What's your name? And God doesn't even answer. God just says, I am who I am. In the Hebrew, this means that I will be. In other words, God is saying, I am above all things. I cannot be limited to your human words. The Jews, these ancient Hebrews, they would not even utter the name God. They would not utter Yahweh or Elohim. They didn't do that. Because now you're confining God to this little box that he could be named. So they just didn't do that. The discussion continues. Moses still not accepting his call. Flip over to chapter 4, verse 1. Then Moses answered, but suppose they do not believe me or listen to me, but say, the Lord didn't appear to you. And the Lord said to him, what's that in your hand? And he said, a staff. And he said, okay, throw it on the ground. So he threw the staff on the ground, and it became a snake, and Moses drew back from it. Now, when I read this text, I really started wrestling with it because I'm like, whose unbelief are we dealing with? Moses keeps talking about how the Israelites say, are they going to believe that you sent me to you? Whose unbelief are we dealing with? The Israelites? Pharaoh's? Or is it Moses' unbelief? God wants to give Moses some assurance that his power is going to accompany him. So he takes his staff and Moses throws it on the ground. It becomes a snake. Moses still, I still don't get it. So God says, okay, let me see your hand. And he turns it leprous. And Moses looks at his hand and God makes it clean again. And God says, okay, Moses, if that's not good enough, look, I'm going to turn the Nile into blood and I'm going to turn it back again. What do you think now, Moses? Moses like, yeah, okay, but I'm really still not sure. Let's finish up verses 10 through 13. But Moses said to the Lord, oh, my Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor even now that you have spoken to your servant. But I am slow to speech and slow of tongue. Then the Lord said to him, who gives speech to mortals? Who makes the mute deaf, the seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, and I will be your mouth and teach you what you are to speak. Friends, that's a promise from God. And I think every pastor in every country around the world should hold on to